Hello, everyone. Welcome to this one video lecture. Hopefully, it's the only one that we have. Again, apologies for canceling class. I was not feeling well, and I needed to go to the emergency room. I am okay now, obviously, as you can tell, because I'm recording this. When it happened, I could not move. So anyway, just wanted to say I am feeling better. I should be in class on Monday, so everything should be back to normal. That being said, this is the lecture video. Again, apologies that this is not in person. I know I made a big deal about I prefer a whiteboard versus a PowerPoint, but yet here we are. So this PowerPoint is available to you on Blackboard. It's already there before this recording is even uploaded. But I wanted to let you know, hey, this is the notes. I encourage you to take notes outside of what is written on these slides. These slides are the main points to make sure that I cover everything and that you know what's the important pieces of this chapter. Other than that, there will be a quiz, which was always planned to happen, and that will go live after this video lecture is uploaded as well. So anyway, we got to talk about the criminal justice system. And what I really want to focus on, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff within the textbook, and it covers a lot of content, but really we're getting into the specific points, and this is kind of following up what we talked about last time on Monday. So the criminal justice system is a wide-spanning and wide-reaching thing here in the United States. It does cover a lot of things, and so we did kind of a little bit talk about this. If you look at centerpieces, three main parts of the criminal justice system is police, courts, and corrections. Those are the three main areas of criminal justice that we talk about, and we're going to talk about each one of those specifically. But the other thing that I really want to emphasize to you is that here in the United States, our criminal justice system is a dual federalism system. What this means, and this is for our government as well, it's a dual federalist system. It means that there is a federal level and there is the individual state levels. We have two types of government, two types of criminal justice, two types of things running at all times. We have that federal level, which guidelines everything, and we have the individual state level. Okay? So, I want to emphasize this to all of you. Those of you who have had a criminal justice class before should already know this, but the criminal justice system, because we have that federal level and state level, things vary from state to state. So what is legal in Pennsylvania might not be legal in Ohio. What's legal in Florida might not be legal in North Dakota. What's legal in South Dakota might not be legal in North Dakota. Like, legitimately, the state systems have a lot of freedom and leeway that they can choose how they want to approach those things. Because of that, that means that a lot of this that we talk about in criminal justice from an academic standpoint is theoretical. Okay? And that's something that I want you to get out from all of these classes. So if you take any other criminal justice class, not just this one, is that everything that you are learning in these classes for the criminal justice thing is theoretical. Academic criminal justice discussions are theoretical because every state does things differently. Every local jurisdiction does things differently. The federal level has a set of rules, but even that works very theoretically. So what you should know is that the way we talk about it, those theoreticals, that's the way the system should operate, the way the system should work. It doesn't necessarily mean that it does happen. And that's a whole another complicated kettle of fish that we'll get into later in the semester. But another thing to note is that the rule of law, and this is something that for a lot of everyday people, you kind of go, well, that's not true. It is, and we do have a problem with this in general within our justice system as well, and that's the rule of law. Everyone must follow the law. That is a basic tenet of the criminal justice system, is that everyone must follow the law. No one person is above the law. That was something the founding fathers put forward when they formed our government in the United States that nobody was above the law. America doesn't have a king. No one is above the law. Okay? Just going to put that out there. We're going to move on. So this is going to be one of the most important documents that we talk about in criminal justice, and if you're not familiar with it, you're going to become somewhat familiar with it over this class and maybe a couple others, but the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution is the most powerful and influential law in the United States. If someone asked you what is the most important law of the United States, you could say the Constitution, and it's true. It's why we have such a thing as constitutional rights. So no law that is ever made at any level, federal, state, local, can violate a constitutional right. And the constitutional rights are, you are given the right to life. You are given, from what we know of the amendments, you have the right to bear arms. You have the right to freedom of speech. You are given a fair and equal trial. Like, all of these things are constitutional rights. It is the most powerful law of the United States. And if that's violated, it's a whole big problem. And so, there is actual processes, and we do talk about it in criminal law a little bit, how if a constitutional right is violated, there is a process for that. We also briefly talk about it in Intro to Policing. Just wanted to let you know. Anyway, with the U.S. Constitution and your constitutional rights, there is a very particular piece that I want to emphasize, and that's the exclusionary rule. And this is going to come up again later, and that's why I'm saying and why it's important for the chapter 1. The exclusionary rule means that any evidence that is obtained illegally cannot be used against you in a court of law. So it's a classic, it's fruit from a poison tree or a thing of that nature. Essentially, if a police officer or anyone illegally obtains something that proves your guilt and they try to use it in court and it was obtained illegally, that is a violation of your constitutional right to privacy and is not allowed to be used. It's a whole complicated matter. So, I do want to emphasize, though, that going back to the U.S. Constitution, no law can violate a constitutional right. When we have these things happen, those laws immediately and very quickly get overturned. So now we're going to talk about the very specific groupings. Remember from that first slide, we said the three main parts of the criminal justice system are police, courts, and corrections. So we're going to look at those. So the first one is the police. And so the police are known as the enforcement part of the law. Their job is to make sure that laws are followed, that, things work the way that they're supposed to. But it's not just about enforcing the law. And that's something that a lot of people who do not know much about policing or have not taken an intro to policing class or haven't ever known and really talked to someone who works in policing, you might not know this, but catching the bad guy and the law enforcement side of it is not the primary job of the police. It's a part of the job, but it's not just that. It's also providing services for the community. And it's also about order maintenance. And so hopefully my students who have taken Intro to Policing, this is familiar to you. But those of you who are new to this, order maintenance is the everyday things that help maintain the smooth operation of society. So order maintenance is things like traffic control and things like that. So really, police aren't just here to enforce the law and make sure you're following the rules, but they're also there to make sure that everything in our society is operating at the most efficient manner possible. And it gets complicated. There are different theories of policing and whatnot. And for that, take Intro to Policing. But just in general, I want you to remember, for those of you who are learning about this, policing is enforcing the law, but it's not just that. The primary job is not to catch the bad guy. It's to make sure that society operates properly and works. And part of that order maintenance, part of that making sure that things work the way it should, as well as, providing services and enforcing the law, is the ability of discretion. And this is something that leads to a lot of debates and arguments about policing in general, and so we do need to talk about it here. And so discretion is the ability to make decisions based on an individual's personal decisions, their personal beliefs, their personal thoughts. So when police are out on the beat, when they're out on the roads and they're engaging with people, they have discretion to stop you for a crime or not. Usually it's a lot more complicated than that. It's usually like, well, is it causing a great disturbance? Is it going to help prevent further crime? There's a whole lot of things that go behind it, but the idea is that because police deal with a wide range of people daily with a lot of different needs, whether that be mental health, physical disabilities, whatever that may be, they have the ability to decide whether or not to charge someone with a crime. It's why most of the time people who jaywalk don't get charged with jaywalking. Yes, walking across the street not in the crosswalk is illegal. But how often do you see someone get ticketed for that? That comes down to discretion. Most police don't really do that unless it's causing a major problem. That's police discretion in a nutshell. It's way more complicated than that. So I'm not going to try and pretend like that covers it. But for the basic understanding, it's the ability to make decisions based on their own personal thoughts and beliefs and opinions and decisions. This is what leads to some discussions about the use of force, and we'll talk about that later. All right, so the second main part is the courts, and so their primary job is to interpret the law. And that means they look at the laws and they decide, yeah, this is what it means. And so what that also means is in the court system, they determine people's guilt and they determine punishment. And we're going to talk about punishment here in just a little bit. But guilt is something, if you notice, I put both guilt and punishment in quotations. Like I said, we're going to talk about punishment later, but guilt, why I put it in quotations is it is the role and job of the court to determine if someone committed a crime or not, based off of the evidence. That is what we mean by guilt. Not that someone actually did it, not that someone feels remorse for it, but that the court is deciding based on the evidence that this individual committed the crime. And that's actually why, if you go down to the last bullet, the last main bullet, the finder of fact, the one who decides a case. This is the term that we use to refer to the jury in most general crimes, or a judge when we talk about bench trials. Again, we'll talk more about this later, so don't worry about that. But the finder of fact is the person who hears all the evidence and determines the guilt of the party. Who committed the crime, who did what, and what kind of punishment they may or may not deserve. So, the courts are broken into judges and lawyers. Obviously, the jury is its own separate thing, but that is a jury of peers. It's a bunch of individuals. It is not people who work necessarily within the system itself. But this is something that needs to be said about our court system. The U.S. legal system is designed to be adversarial. It's not finding a collective agreement. It is one side fighting the other. And it's two teams, the prosecution or the prosecutor, which acts on behalf of the government, and the defendant or the defense. And they're the people who are being accused of the whatever crime that they're being charged with. The U.S. legal system is designed to have a winner and a loser. Okay? This means that the system is sometimes not fair and very upsetting. But because of the rules that we put in place, we try to make it as fair and equal as possible. All right. And then the last group, or the last major part of criminal justice, is the corrections part. And they're the people that oversee the punishment. And again, we're going to talk more about punishment as a term way later, because punishment is not always necessarily a bad thing, and I want to emphasize that now. But corrections includes things like probation, parole, jail, and prison. And I'm sure that most of you have heard some of those terms, if not all of those terms before. And obviously we'll go more in depth on these later, not just, now, but like later in the semester. But real short and sweet overview, probation versus parole. Parole is a early release, and probation is not going to prison and having certain rules to follow. But the big one, and this is one that usually in the Intro to Criminal Justice class tends to be the weird, surprising fact that people didn't know, there is a difference between a jail and a prison. Okay? So, a jail is typically, and I want to emphasize typically, a smaller system or a smaller entity, often run by a sheriff or whatever the local municipality is, and it's for minimal sentences. Jails are where people are usually held before court hearings and things like that. Jails are for usually less than a year sentence. They can be a little more than a year. It all depends on, a lot of different factors, but they're for shorter sentences. They're not for serious crimes. They're really there to be a facility to hold individuals. Prisons, on the other hand, are larger facilities, and they tend to have the more serious cases and the longer term sentences. They usually are run by either the state or the federal government. We do have federal prisons and state prisons, but it gets complicated. There are different types of prisons and jails, and we will talk about them later. But what's important for you to know is that a jail is not a prison. They're not the same word, or the same thing. You just replace the word. They are two different things. Just know that a jail tends to be smaller and a prison is for serious crimes and is a big facility. They also offer a lot of services for their inmates. The other thing that is to note, despite the fact that Erie County Prison is called Erie County Prison, it is technically a jail. It's a weird subsection title thing. We're not really going to get into it here, but just know that technically Erie County Prison, the one that is here in Erie City, is a jail, not a prison. All right. So now we actually get to come to one of our first words that we're going to really talk about that is relevant to this. And we kind of spent some time talking about it on Monday, and that's justice. Justice is a weird term. What does justice mean? And our textbook really emphasizes this, and it's a very good way to get into the deeper discussion of justice. And it's the idea of equality versus equity. And so equality is where everyone is equal, whereas equity is where everyone gets what is deserved. And notice I put that in quotes as well. When we talk about equality, this means that everything plays out the exact same way. No matter who you are, what crime you did, anything, you are given the same right as everyone else. This is why the justice system as a whole is complicated, because it is both equality and equity. The equality part is everyone is given the right to a trial by jury for a criminal sentence. Doesn't matter if you killed someone, doesn't matter if you lit a house on fire, doesn't matter if you stole something. You are given the right to a jury, or to a trial by jury. You are given the right to have legal representation. That is equality. Everyone is equal. However, the equity side of this is, do you put someone on death row and have them killed because they burnt down a house? Is that equal to someone who did commit murder? That's a whole nother mess. So that's where equity is. You get what's deserved. And so this comes down to the very basic general idea of retributive justice versus procedural justice. Procedural justice is the true equality part. That is, that you are given due process, that everyone is given the exact same rights, the exact same opportunities that anyone else does. Whereas retributive justice is that your punishment fits the crime. And if you've ever heard of it, this is the old school, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If you kill someone, you deserve to be killed. If you stole something, something gets to be stolen from you. That kind of idea. Now, both within the criminal justice system and outside of it, there is a debate over what equity and equality looks like and if that is truly justice. That's not our job. Our job is simply to understand that justice is a complicated matter, and for our purposes, for criminal justice purposes, what we are trying to do is make sure that everyone gets a fair chance, they get their due process, and that they are fairly punished for their crime, that their punishment fits the crime. All right. So, within the criminal justice system, the other thing to note is that it's closely related to the government and the way that our U.S. government is. We have the three branches of government. I know this is like going to high school civics, ethics, whatever course that you may have taken. Government doesn't matter, where you learned about the roles, the branches of government and things like that. Yeah, we're talking about that here as well, but we're also going to talk about the specific role of criminal justice within those branches. So the three main branches of our government is the legislative, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. The legislative branch is, is Congress, it's the House of Representatives, it's the people who act on behalf of the vast majority of the people here in the United States. They act as the direct response to the constituents, to the citizens. In regards to the criminal justice system, our focus is on Congress, because Congress is a big part of who makes the laws. Yes, the House of Representatives is a big part of it. Yes, the executive branch and the judicial branch, they're all part of it because there's different aspects of it. But Congress and the House of Representatives make the laws. They're the group that looks at, okay, well, this is what we want to pass as a law that says you cannot do this. And so actually, as a result from Congress and everything, we now have what is known as the criminal code or the penal code. And this is really just a general list of laws about crime at the federal level and are used at the state level as well. It really is just, this is what the crime is. This is how it should be charged. These are some guidelines. That's what the penal code is. It's, if you do this, this is illegal. This is breaking the law. The judicial branch of the government is the court system, and the big one that we focus on is SCOTUS, or the Supreme Court of the United States. And other than the fact that the Supreme Court has made some not great choices in the last couple of years, it's been definitely under very harsh review and consideration. It's important to note that the Supreme Court, their role as the judicial part of the criminal justice system is to interpret the laws. So Congress makes the laws, but then the Supreme Court has to decide, how do we use those laws? How do we make sense of it? How do we apply it to this crime? How do we apply it to this group of people? They're the ones that make vast hitting decisions. This is why, technically speaking, the Supreme Court was able to make a decision to overturn the decision of Roe v. Wade with the more recent one. This is how that happens, is because they have this ability called judicial review. And notice I have that term there for you. Judicial review is where the court system, specifically Supreme Court, but other lower courts do this as well. What they do is they analyze the decisions and cases that have happened and have been brought forward to them, and they in turn suggest reviews or changes or how things should operate. Judicial review literally is looking at the laws that are there and looking at cases and saying, does this fit? Do we need to change it? And then last but certainly not least is the executive branch of government, which is known as the police, or as the president's branch. You know, it's the president, vice president, secretary, it's that whole cabinet stuff. But from criminal justice standpoint, the executive branch is where the police and all of our famous three-letter services and things like that fall under. They're under the executive branch because the executive branch is all about enforcing the law. Congress makes the laws, the Supreme Court interprets the laws, and then the president says these are the laws that we must follow. And then it's up to every police, every agency to make sure that those laws are being enforced. That is how criminal justice works in our United States government system. Okay? So it's important to note, now that you understand that there's complexities in different parts of the criminal justice system, that there are three overarching goals of the criminal justice system, and this is at every level. Whether it's the lowest level podunk police department, or it's the highest level Supreme Court, or the highest level whatever it might be, there are supposed to be the three overarching goals of the criminal justice system. And that's efficiency, effectiveness, and fairness. And obviously I explained a little bit what those mean underneath. Efficiency is using available resources in the most cost-effective way. Things work and run smoothly, and not cheaply, but cheaply. Effectiveness is ensure equity, proportionality, constitutional protections are followed, and the public safety is maintained. The effectiveness of the criminal justice system, we want to make sure that it is fair. We want to make sure that everyone is being protected and that this public safety is there. And then the fairness aspect of it. Everyone is given due process. There should not be a clear issue of fairness within the criminal justice system. Yes, I know I said that in a very weird way, and I did that on purpose. We do have some issues of fairness within our CJ system currently, and it's a larger debate that we can't really get into here. So we've talked about the system. Now we need to talk about crime, because we have talked about justice. We've talked about how the criminal justice system operates, but you need to know what the heck a crime is. And so, again, these are all very broad, high-level things. Obviously, we will dive more into a lot of this as we go throughout. We'll dig deeper into these things, but for our purposes, for our first go-around and for learning about these just from Chapter 1, there are two types of crime, and we talked about this already as well on Monday, so this is kind of review, but here's your fancy Latin words: mala in se and mala prohibita. So the two types of crimes are mala in se and mala prohibita. I will never ask you to remember those exact words. I will give you those words and ask you, what do they mean? Just telling you that now. I'm not going to ask you to remember the Latin. But mala in se is that they're wrongs in themselves. Or in other words, they are agreed upon really bad crimes. These are the things that we all agree on, like murder, sexual assault, like those things we agree. They're bad. Like there's no middle ground where you can say, well, it was okay. No. Killing people in general is wrong. Assaulting people is wrong. Period. Mala prohibita means wrongs because we said so. They are, mala is wrongs or evils. Mala prohibita, we prohibit them. That's why they're wrongs. So they're the wrongs that we as general society have agreed upon are bad. These are the things like, money laundering, arson. Like arson's in a weird one. It's kind of a mala in se, but it's kind of a prohibita. This is going back to our terrible example. Public nudity is a mala prohibita. It's not a wrong in itself. It's wrong because we said it is. Yeah. Those are the types of crimes. Those are the two major types of crimes. But crime is more complicated than just saying, oh, it's either wrong because it is or it's wrong because we said so. Well, there's also different levels, and so we classify crimes. And in criminal justice, we call that grading a crime. Just like in education, you grade things, you get A, B, C, D, F. Well, when we talk about crime, we grade crimes. We grade them either felonies, misdemeanors, or violations. Technically, there's a fourth one that's a felony misdemeanor. It's a complicated matter. You're going to learn very quickly. Criminal justice is very complicated. Please note that felonies are the most serious crimes. These are the ones that are the mallet and say, we know that they're wrong. Misdemeanors can be either wrongs in themselves or wrongs because we said so. Misdemeanors are still serious, but they're less serious crimes. And violations are the lowest crimes. These are really like you didn't park your car on the right side of the street. You crossed across the street, not in the crosswalk. Violations are the little things that really aren't bad, but you understand why. That's how we generally classify them. Like I said, there's a fourth one that's a felony misdemeanor. It's between felony and misdemeanor because it's a bridging gap between those two. But what I want you to understand from this grading of crime is that these crimes can be graded differently depending on jurisdiction. So because states can choose things differently, it means that arson of an abandoned building in one state might be a misdemeanor, but might be a felony in another. Assault and battery might be a felony in one place and a misdemeanor in another. Battery also might be a felony or a misdemeanor depending on if a weapon was used. So just because we have the simple grading system doesn't mean it's equal across the board. Crimes can be graded differently depending on the jurisdiction, depending on any number of factors. And so it's important to note that there are differences. So, how do we measure crime? It's a weird question, and not a lot of people really think about it, especially if you're not super into criminal justice, and this is like your first foray, your first interest in criminal justice. You might be like, well, what do you mean measure crime? So, measuring crime, one way that we show effectiveness in criminal justice is we have data to show that crimes that are being committed are being taken care of. And so we need to measure that. We also need to measure when crimes are being reported so that we know what's going on. And so two of our big pieces of measuring crime, there's way more. There's things like crime mapping and whatnot, but we talk about those in other classes. Don't worry about that here. We might briefly talk about them later. But for our purposes, for the intro to criminal justice, it's important to understand that when we measure crime, the two primary sources we use both come from the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they've had this report for the longest time. It's called the Uniform Crime Report, the UCR. And what this is all reported data from police departments all across the United States. They share their data annually, and the FBI compiles all this data and releases a UCR where it shows these are the types of crimes being committed in these areas in these states, and it shows all this type of data. All the data comes from police departments. It is technically required that all departments have to submit that data. However, things happen. It's not a perfect system, and so sometimes there are gaps in our data. And so another thing that the FBI started doing was the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS. This was that not all the data that they were getting from the police departments was covering the full spectrum of crimes that were being reported, whether it was because a police department wasn't reporting it or simply there were gaps in the data. And so they extended their data. It's not just from police departments, but it include data from social service departments as well to get an idea of the crimes that are being reported. So even if they weren't being completed by the police. So they might have been reported but not gone anywhere past an initial report. We had the data to show these are the number of crimes that are being committed. Period. So that's how we measure crime. But it's important to note that in 1973, the Bureau of Justice Statistics were looking at all this stuff, and they realized that there was a huge gap in the data. And what they did was they called this the dark figure of crime. And that was on average about half of all crime goes unreported. And so very particularly, the one that the textbook uses and is still accurate to this day is the number of sexual assault cases is over half that goes unreported. Over 50% of all sexual assault cases go unreported to the police. And so they noticed, like I said, the Bureau of Justice Statistics looking at all this stuff went, when we talk to specific social services and victim services and hospitals, we have data that is not being captured by the policing, and this is a real problem. And they were doing better with the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is still fairly new, but they realized they weren't getting the full data. And so they developed what was called the National Crime Victimization Survey. This was sent out to individuals who had expressed any type of feeling of victimized from a crime, whether that be to a hospital, to a therapist, to whatever. It was not run through the police department. It was just run through the Bureau of Justice Statistics so that they could find out what kind of information are they lacking. And so now the National Crime Victimization Survey is also housed within the FBI. Like the FBI holds onto all this stuff and does all these data and reports. But it's important to note that even though we've gotten better at getting out and finding that data, the dark figure of crime is still a reality. And you can look up on the FBI's website, and I will upload it when I can, but the dark figure of crime is still an accurate problem. There's still, on average, most of the crimes that are committed, they break it down based on crime. There's still right about 50% of crimes go unreported. So like the arson might be like 60% reported. So that means there's still 40% of arsons that go unreported. Sexual assault is still very high in the like 50 to 60 range of being unreported, things like that. So the dark figure of crime is that not all crime is reported. And in fact, about half of all crime goes unreported. The other thing that came from this was the FBI created a list of the most serious and frequently committed crimes, and they call these index crimes. This is essentially just a short list of, if they categorize them by like tier 1, 2, 3, this is tier 1. These are the ones that are most frequently committed. These are the ones that they have, sadly enough, the most data on because they are the most frequently committed. And so these are criminal homicide, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor theft, vehicle theft, and arson. Those are the big ones. And not to say that there aren't crimes that are way worse, not to say that there are crimes that shouldn't be on there, but these are the ones that are most frequently committed. And so the FBI considers them the most serious because these are the ones that we have the most data on. So homicide, sexual assault, I don't really need to explain, but robbery. Robbery is stealing something via force or through the threat of force. Aggravated assault is assault with the use of a weapon. Burglary is the unlawful entry into a place. And larceny is theft, okay? Obviously, you could put motor vehicle theft with larceny, but the FBI separates them because there are enough motor vehicle thefts separate from other thefts that it gets its own designation. And then arson is setting fire, period. Like it's burning stuff and things that you shouldn't be burning. People, buildings, things like that. So before we get into our last slide, which is some key terms, we got to talk about the process of the criminal justice system. And so really the process is pretty straightforward. excuse me, the process is that a crime is reported, there's an investigation, then there's an arrest, a trial. After the trial, they're either sent to corrections or they're released because they were found not guilty. But if they go to corrections, then they get released. That's the process in a nutshell, like very basic, broad strokes. But I want to note, going back to the dark figure of crime, the first step in the criminal justice process is that a crime is reported. This means for every crime that goes unreported, none of this happens. There is no investigation, there is no arrest, there is no trial. This is why it is a dark figure of crime. Because if we report it, it goes through these steps. If we do not report it, none of this happens. And so there's just a couple things that I want to expand on with the process. And obviously you can see on the right-hand side, we have arrest and trial has additional things. We're going to talk about those as well. But I want to emphasize with investigations. In Intro to Policing, you talk a little more about this, but the investigations, there's a preliminary investigation and there are follow-up investigations. A preliminary investigation is what happens when the crime is first reported and the officer arrives on that scene. The follow-up investigations are all the things that you see in the traditional crime shows where they go and investigate crime scenes and they talk to witnesses and things like that. That's usually all part of the follow-up. The preliminary investigation is the one that's done by the officer when they've discovered the crime scene before the main character of your crime drama shows up. Just so you know. I do want to emphasize this as well before I dive any further. And I probably should have said this way back at the beginning. Hollywood policing and the criminal justice system is not accurate. There are parts that are correct, and a lot of the shows and movies and things do a really good job at a couple pieces, but the system itself is very complex and is not really anything like what you see on TV. So I want to emphasize that now. I'll use TV as examples to explain those ideas and concepts in general terms, but I want you to know like there is a very different thing than what we see on TV. And so after the investigation is done, there is an arrest, and that's where you physically take a person into custody. This is the actual, like, okay, we are taking the person by some use of force, and we'll talk about that, and we are taking them into the process of the policing part, the arresting part. And so that's where we go over to this other side. So with arresting, we have booking, charging, initial appearance, preliminary hearing, grand jury, arraignment, pretrial detention or bail, and plea bargaining. That's a lot of things. I'm going to go through this easily. So if arrest is the taking the person in, booking is the identifying process of the individual at whatever holding facility. So they take them to the jail, and booking is where, you know, they take the fingerprints, they get all that information done. Charging is where the case file, which is everything that the investigation has gathered about the individual, about the crime, it goes to the prosecutor to make the decision of whether or not to charge or to release. If they release, everything else is over. The person is let go. If they are charged, there is an initial appearance that is allowed where a magistrate or a local judge level, as someone who is being charged, you can meet with them to have your charges read to you. Essentially being told, hey, this is what's going to be happening. This is why you are here currently. After that part, there's a preliminary hearing and or a grand jury. This step, all it is where individuals outside of your control determine whether or not that the case will go to court. A preliminary hearing is often done by a judge, and so a judge will look at it and decide, okay, based off of the evidence, will this go to trial? If the answer is yes, okay, we go through the rest of it and go to arraignment and all that other stuff. If it is not, you release the person. A grand jury is still a jury of your peers. However, it's slightly different than a traditional jury or a court case. A grand jury is 26 people, not 12 people. It's a group of more people who hear all the evidence that's presented in very basic form. Like, it's not all fancy. There's not a whole, over the next 40 hours, I'm going to be going over this. No, it's, here are the details. Here's what we have. And that group of people determine if it's going to go to court or not. Grand juries used to be way more popular in this country. Nowadays, it's a lot more preliminary hearings, but there are still grand juries out there. So if you ever hear a discussion of a grand jury, it's they take all the evidence to a group of people to determine, do you think that a group of 12 people can agree to convict someone on this crime or not? And then they go forward with it. That's really what a grand jury does. So that's why they're both the same thing, but they are slightly different. At that point, then it goes into arraignment. This is where your formal charges are read in a court, and you enter a plea, and that's the plea of guilty or not guilty. Yep, that's right. When you are arraigned, you are read your official charges, and you get to determine if you plead guilty or not guilty. After that point, in that arraignment, there is the pretrial detention or bail, as well as plea bargaining. Pretrial detention or bail, the difference here, pretrial detention means you are going to be held at a jail facility until your trial begins. Bail is an alternative. It is a monetary value that says, hey, I'm paying you this much money so that I don't have to sit my time in jail, but I promise I will show up to court on that day. That's what bail is for. It's saying, hey, you will come on this day and go to court, but this is how much money you need to not sit in jail for. And so the other thing during the arraignment process, after your charges are gathered and everything, is plea bargaining. And plea bargaining should be pretty obvious. Like, if you like cop shows, you probably heard of He Took a Plea Bargain. I want to tell you right now, plea bargaining is way more common in real life than in Hollywood. Like, that's almost standard. It's very common. Not all cases go to trial. And it's because a plea bargain is where you take a lesser charge for a lesser sentence. Plea bargaining is almost a regular piece of the real court system. Not every trial, or not every trial goes to court. Okay, so I wanted to emphasize that. The other thing is, once it goes to trial is pretty straightforward. It's if you've watched any coverage of any trials, you know what a trial looks like. It's where the two sides get to have the discussion over, here's the evidence, here is the client, here is whatever, and this is what I'm saying. Please, jury, choose guilty or not guilty. That's all a trial is. And obviously we'll talk way more about trials later, but what's important is that after a trial, there are two other sub-steps that happen, and that's appeal and sentencing. So sentencing is where you are given your punishment. So when the trial is over and the jury has made a determination, you are sentenced, you are given whatever your time may be, and however that punishment may look. If you disagree with your sentencing, you may appeal. That is a right given in the United States judicial system as part of due process and justice and equality. You are allowed to appeal your charges. And so you can go through that appeal process. And no matter how it goes, you usually then go into corrections and then release. And so corrections, there's two goals of corrections: punish and rehabilitate. Rehabilitate, the goal is to get you back out into society and reformed. Punish is just to punish you for your crime. And so that finally brings us to one of the last slides. There's one more after this, and it's just a brief one. It's important to talk about. But here are some key terms that are going to come up throughout the semester And there are things that you need to know, and there are things that are brought up throughout these first couple parts of the chapter, but I wanted to emphasize them on our own slide so that we could actually talk about them and so you would know. So recidivism is a term that you're going to hear a lot, and recidivism is just the repeated recommitting of a crime and going back within the system. There is a problem of recidivism where once someone commits a crime, they're more likely to recommit the crime or commit another crime. So in a lot of criminal justice scholarship, we look at recidivism rates. We try to find how to reduce the number of people that are repeating offenses or going back to prison. That's recidivism. Probable cause is the idea that there is a justifiable, logical reason to do what you are doing, or rather for you to investigate. And what this comes down to is a reasonable person, given the same information you have, would make the same choice. That's probable cause. Reasonable force is complicated. The use of force by police officers is a complicated matter, especially in the wake of several issues of police brutality and abuse of power, and we'll talk about that throughout the semester. But reasonable force is using an appropriate amount of force to incapacitate an individual who is resisting arrest. That is what reasonable force should be. Reasonable force should almost 99.99% of the time never be deadly force. There's a very rare circumstance where it should be. But 99.9% of the time, deadly force is never reasonable force. Okay? So, two other terms that we're going to talk about. One of them you already have been knowing about for a while, which is punishment, but burden of proof. Within the court system, it is the duty of the prosecution. They are given the burden of proof. They have to show the jury without a shadow of a doubt, in most cases, that the individual did commit the crime. The burden of proof is on them. It's literally what is the bare minimum you need to prove that that person did it. And then we get into that last term, punishment. When we talk about punishment in the criminal justice system, we're talking about the end result of committing a crime. We're talking about the result from you committed a crime. This is what you get for that crime. Punishment is not always bad. Punishment has a strong connotation with being a bad word. You get punished. Oh, that means you're getting hurt. That means no. Punishment is the result of what you get for committing a crime. And we will talk more about types of punishments and theories of punishment later in this class. But I wanted to emphasize that punishment is not necessarily a bad thing when we use that term alone. Okay? And so the last thing that I want to talk about, and this is an important thing for criminal justice as a whole, as the system, and that is the pendulum of punishment, the pendulum of criminal justice. Every decade, every couple decades, we go back and forth, especially in the last 50 to 70 years. We've gone back and forth between being tough on crime and harsher punishments versus we should really be lighter and treating it like a mental disability or a mental health crisis. And so we should be lighter on crime and more rehabilitative. We go back and forth on this all the time, and the data is not heavily stacked in one way's favor or the other. Criminal justice is always changing. Our concepts and beliefs on how we punish individuals are constantly changing. And so understand that all the things we are talking about now, we look at the historical aspect and we talk about how it is in the now. But realistically, 10 years from now, it could look very different. We don't know. The pendulum of punishment, the pendulum of criminal justice is constantly moving. And if anything, we are now currently on the backswing of the rehabilitation side. We've focused a lot on rehabilitating people, and there's a strong push for harsher punishments again. So we'll see how that pendulum goes. It's still too early to tell. But that's it. That's what I was going to talk about on Wednesday. Obviously, I was going to have you engaged and asking me questions and us talking through the whole thing. So apologies that it wasn't quite the same caliber that you'll get in the classroom when we talk about other things. But this is Intro to Criminal Justice. This is the content that we're looking at. These are the types of things we're going to be talking about. I look forward to engaging in this stuff with you, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts and opinions on a lot of these things. Anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this video, listening to this video, however you managed to go through with it. Again, thank you for working with me. Again, apologies that I wasn't there on Wednesday. Like I said, I should be back Monday, and we will get further into all this stuff about criminal justice. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.